Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Mangelsdorf, and I am your host this evening. Welcome to this evening's webinar on Should I Charge My Child Rent? Issues Family Members Need to Know. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening, Alicia Albus and Nikki Mitchell with Mitchell Brown and Associates, elder law and special needs attorneys. So, on to you all.
Well, thank you for inviting us this evening, and it's a pleasure to speak with you all. Tonight we'll be talking about four basic topics, and we'll have some questions, of course, at the end. We will be talking about the basics of SSI rules, what is in-kind support and maintenance, how do I prevent a reduction in benefits, and then we'll go through some real-life scenarios with actual numbers and people, which might help kind of illustrate what we've been talking about during the presentation, and then we'll take some questions. So the basics of SSI rules. As you all probably know, SSI is supplemental security income. It is a needs-based benefit, so we have to be very careful with what we are counting as income and assets and how we qualify. We want to stay qualified, so we have to make sure we're paying attention to the rules. That is separate then and distinct from SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, and that's not needs-based. But tonight we're focusing on the SSI rules. This screen you're looking at here is the POMS, which is the Program Operations Manual System, and that is the basically the guidebook that the caseworkers are using when they were evaluating the Social Security applications and reinvestigations and that sort of thing. They're using the guidelines throughout the content on this site to determine eligibility. So it's very important that you maybe take a look at this. It looks really sort of overwhelming and daunting when you first get there, but there's a table of contents, as you can see, and it breaks it up into the different topics. So it is pretty user-friendly. We've got the site there, so if you feel like want to really explore something like this and you're wide awake, then feel free and to check that out. But it does have some very good information and will help you understand the rules of SSI. As you can see on the next slide, sort of the introduction to SSI and the principles. And you'll notice we've kind of circled there at the top right corner and the bottom right corner, those dates. So they're always changing. These kind of provisions and guidelines are very, very often changing. So just be careful that when you're looking at that, you're noticing if it's something that's been updated recently, or if it's a recent change that's important to note. And so obviously the introduction here, because this slide shows the policy principles. Then at the bottom, it talks about whose resources can count. So it just shows you how you can find different important aspects of the SSI program. The resources that can count talks about how income can be deemed to different individuals in the home. We'll get to that in the next slide. So what is needs-based and what does that mean? Needs-based benefits have limits on what you can own and how much income you can have. So keep in mind, we're talking about two different requirements, the income and the assets. So try to keep those distinct in your mind. SSI has an asset limit of $2,000. That does not include, however, your home, as long as it's the primary residence. You may have a car of any value. Assets up to $100,000 in an ABLE account. We can't really explore the ABLE account at this webinar, but that's a very important idea to keep in mind when you're in an SSI situation, because it can be very helpful to maintain eligibility. You can also have a prepaid burial plan if the contract is irrevocable. If the contract is not irrevocable, then it would count toward that $2,000 limit. So you want to make sure that it is you have an agreement with the funeral home that indicates that it is an irrevocable contract. SSI has an income limit based on the formula, so it counts both earned income and unearned income, and we'll talk about those in the next few slides. Think of the primary focus, though, when we're talking about income is it food or shelter, and can it be used for those purposes? That's the main question that Social Security is looking at when we're determining eligibility based on these rules. It's important to know also that income can be deemed to a minor child from a parent's income. And that's sort of a topic in of itself also, but just the sort of high level view of that is if you are a disabled blind child under age 18 and you're living with your parents, if at least one parent does not receive SSI, then you may have to count some of the parent's income in figuring the child's SSI benefit. Once the child turns 18, then that would not apply any longer. So SSI and earned income. So the first part we'll talk about is earned income. Earned income will include wages, any net earnings from self-employment, payments for services performed in a sheltered workshop or some similar center, and any royalties that are earned. So that's your earned income. To exclude from the earned income, so first you're going to put sort of the earned income in a basket, and then we're going to take things away from that basket that does not count as earned income, which would be $20 general income exclusion that applies to both earned income and unearned income. Then you get to deduct $65 of that earned income each month. And then you also are allowed to exclude earned income used to pay impairment related work expenses. And that's very important. Those can be expenses that allow you to do the job, and really without paying for those certain expenses, you couldn't do the job. So if it's a certain uniform or special shoes or things like that that you have to cover when you're working, those can count as a deduction from that earned income because you're sort of required to pay those expenses to be able to work. And then you have the deduction of half of the remaining earned income. Okay, so then we're turning to unearned income, and that is all income that's not earned income. So that formula, though, if you're looking at unearned income that's excluded from unearned income, that's going to be, again, the $20 general income exclusion that applies to both. Food stamps are not included in unearned income. Energy assistance benefit, that is not included. Any HUD subsidies for any housing allotments that are provided, that is not included. And then any kind of women, children, infants are known as WIC benefits. If you're receiving those types of benefits, those are not included either in unearned income. So in the next slide, you see kind of our illustration of figuring how this all comes together. So when you're looking at your income and your SSI benefit, for 2022, the benefit is $841. So that's where you start. The next step is you're going to deduct your earned income, but then you're going to take away your deductions and exclusions from the earned income. Then you have to subtract your unearned income, but you also get to take away from that your deductions and exclusions. And then if there's any ISM, we'll be talking about in just a few minutes, is in-kind support and maintenance, but we'll get to the details of that in a moment. But that is also comes off your earned income and unearned income. And there are special rules that apply for those different types of income, and we'll go through those in a minute. So after you take out those deductions, then you reach your monthly payment. And it's important to know that your monthly payment could be zero. So you could reduce through those deductions and through the income that your ISM or unearned and earned income, you ultimately could end up with no monthly benefit, which we certainly don't want that to happen. The next slide, we kind of put some numbers on this. So we've got the 841 monthly benefit, and let's say we have earned income of $200. Then you take away your unearned income, that was $300. Then your ISM reduction, which sometimes could be a third of that 841. And then you're left with your monthly payment of $60.67. Okay, so now the question, what is in-kind support and maintenance? So food and shelter are big topics here as far as in-kind support and maintenance. Those are the things we're going to be looking for. So food would include anything that's purchased and consumed at the home or purchased and consumed outside of the home. any food that's provided by an institution, or any food that's provided by a landlord or housemates. So basically, anytime you're getting food from some other source, that's going to be in-kind support and maintenance. Then the shelter expenses that we look at for ISM is anything that we relate to shelter and maintaining that shelter. That would be your mortgage payment, real estate taxes, obviously rent, heating, fuel, gas, electricity, water, sewer, garbage removal. So all things that basically have to do with the shelter would be ISM. And so when we're looking at determining ISM, we're looking at where is it coming from? Is it coming from someone inside the household or outside of the household? And we're looking at this on a monthly basis. So it's an analysis that takes place on a monthly basis. Items that were not recognized as food and shelter would not reduce the benefit because it's not ISM. Some of those examples would be a cell phone payment, cable bill, or insurance payments, because those aren't directly related to the shelter that one has. And it's important to know, as we noted at the bottom with our asterisk, is that you want to make that distinction first. Where's that benefit coming from? Is ISM from someone in the household or someone outside the household? Okay, so the value of 1/3 reduction rule, VTR, what that will apply if ISM is coming from someone inside the household. So the monthly benefit would be reduced by 1/3 if the SSI beneficiary receives food and or shelter from someone inside the household. And if that applies, then you don't have to go any further. Then you apply the 1/3 reduction rule. And it's all or nothing. We can't take part of it. That's going to be the basis of the reduction. Only if the person receives only part of their ISM from inside the household, it still applies. And we'll go through some examples that will illustrate that. For example, here, let's say the SSI recipient's parents are divorced. The SSI recipient lives with his mother, who pays for all the food and all the rent for the household. The SSI recipient's father pays the electric separately as part of the divorce agreement. The SSI recipient's monthly benefit is reduced by 1/3. So in 2022, that was $280 for the rent and food that the mother provides. There's no reduction for the father's electric bill payment. So because that benefit is coming from within the household, then we apply the 1/3 reduction rule and we simply reduce the SSI by 1/3. You don't get to say, a little bit less than 1/3, or that's how it works. It's all or nothing, like we said earlier. The other rule is the presumed maximum value rule, or PMV. That monthly benefit is reduced if we're talking about benefits that are received from someone outside the household, and there are no ISM from anyone inside the household. So for someone that's giving this benefit from outside the household, then it's going to be the presumed maximum value rule. That means that the maximum value of the Social Security that can attribute to ISM is $300.33. And that can be reduced if you can show that the actual value of what you received was not that much. So separate from the VTR rule, you don't get to mitigate the deduction on that. You don't have a choice. That's just all or nothing. That's a solid 1/3. But with the presumed maximum value, you are allowed to show that what you actually received was not as much as that $300.33 figure. So for example, the SSI recipient lives with a roommate and pays half of the rent and utility bills. There's no inside ISM because that SSI recipient pays that's her share of the shelter expenses. But the SSI recipient's parents purchase groceries each month for that SSI recipient. So the food then will be considered outside ISM, and we would use the presumed maximum value rule for that situation. But if the SSI recipient can show that the groceries didn't cost as much as that $300 figure, then they can reduce that number, and we can show that that actually wasn't what was received.
Thanks, Alicia. And I know for everybody that was a lot of information that we kind of threw in. It's the foundation of the rules that we're going to be talking about. And all of that leads us up to the whole point of this presentation, which is how do we stop a reduction in benefits? And, what can we do? We all know $841 a month is not a ton of money. You can't do a lot with it. So we want to make sure we're getting the full benefit every month to the extent that we can. And of course, sometimes there are just situations where that's not possible. And, that's kind of where we're at. But when we can put some things that are relatively pretty straightforward. I know I say that as somebody who does this all the time, so I'm probably biased for that, but there are things we can do to prevent this reduction for everyone. So the main thing is don't pay for food and shelter of an SSI recipient, right? And it sounds so easy to say, well, just don't do that. But again, $841 is not usually going to cover somebody's full expenses every month. And we need to usually supplement that from some source, wherever that may come from. So if we can't avoid paying for these things, how do we do it in a way that prevents that reduction? So the primary way, or there's two things, but they're very similar, is these rental contracts. So those VTR and PMV rules that we just discussed, Alicia just went over, which is the rules that apply to how a deduction is put in place for in-kind support and maintenance. Because remember, there are really three ways we can reduce a monthly benefit: earned income, unearned income, and in-kind support and maintenance. But both of these rules for in-kind support and maintenance have an exclusion if the SSI recipient is paying for their monthly expenses via a rental contract, because the rental contract creates rental liability, this legal obligation, right, of the SSI recipient to contribute toward their share of the household cost. And it doesn't really matter for these purposes whether or not they are paying somebody who is inside the household or outside the household. And I want to take just a quick step back and, just so you can kind of visualize what we're talking about with inside or outside the household. Outside the household would be like paying to a landlord, right? You rent an apartment either by yourself or with a roommate, and you're sending a check every month to a landlord. That's pretty straightforward. That's an outside the household payment source. But if you have a roommate and maybe your roommate's name is on the lease, but you pay your roommate half of the rent every month, that's inside the household. For these purposes, if you have a contract in place between either the landlord or the roommate, it doesn't matter. You're still going to save yourself from getting that reduction. And again, true whether the landlord lives with the SSI person or not. But in a rental contract, we are only contemplating shelter expenses. We're not necessarily including food in that. So it's something to keep in mind, because we think about sort of the concept of a traditional lease that is not typically going to include your meals. You're still going to be responsible for going out, buying your own food, cooking your own food, and that kind of thing. So you do still have then the potential for a reduction based on the ISM for food. One note that I'll touch on is that there is some a pending rule change out there that would actually remove food from being counted in the ISM calculations, and we would be left with only shelter expenses. Several years ago, it used to be food, clothing, and shelter. They got rid of clothing a while ago, and now they're talking about getting rid of food. Part of the reason is just so hard for caseworkers to make these determinations and for people to keep track of who's paying for what when we're going out to dinner, those types of things. So they're thinking they may get rid of that. I've heard talk that may happen sometime this fall, but you never really know. Sometimes these rules sit around forever before they actually go into place. But for now, food still counts. So we have to keep that in mind as we're going through. So rental contracts, and we'll talk about some examples for those a little later on in the presentation. The more comprehensive version of this is to do what's called a room and board agreement. And this is something that contemplates both your shelter expenses and your food expenses, at least food expenses that are kind of inside the household. And again, both rules, both BTR and PMV rules, have exclusions that apply if you have a valid room and board agreement in place. So again, as I said, it's similar to a rental agreement, but this covers both food and shelter. So where it's possible, this is the more ideal route to go. Of course, it's not always possible because we're not always in a situation where we can include food, but if you can, it makes it a little bit easier. And again, it doesn't matter who the landlord is, whether they live inside the household or outside the household. This would be true, for example, if you were in like a residential type setting where they do provide your meals and you pay them some amount every month. Most of the time you're going to pay your full SSI amount, so it doesn't make a huge difference, but that is an example of where you'd have somebody who was an outside landlord still providing meals, and not where the more common example where you're living with mom and dad and they're providing everything for you. So the room and board agreement requires that you pay a fixed amount every month. And that amount that you pay has to be always at least the same as whatever the PMV amount is for any given year. So that's for this year, that is that $300.33 number. If you have a room and board rate that is lower than whatever the PMV value is for that year, technically you could still have a further reduction under that rule for inside ISM. So I feel like I'm throwing around abbreviations here, but hopefully some of these will start to stick as we use them a little bit more. So we want to put these agreements in place. What do they need to look like? So first thing is that we did provide a template that you will get in the follow-up email that Brianne will send out for a room and board agreement. It doesn't have to be 10 pages long. It doesn't have to be super fancy. What it needs to do is it has to be in writing, always in writing. And it has to be signed by both parties, both the disabled person, the SSI recipient, or their legal guardian, if they have somebody who has been appointed in that capacity, and the landlord, whoever that's going to be, mom and dad, aunt and uncle, whoever. It cannot be retroactive. I've had clients come in where they have gotten an overpayment notice from Social Security, and they've said, Social Security is saying somebody was providing your room and board for all these months, and you were still getting your full amount of payment. Therefore, we're applying this, PMV rule or VTR rule, whichever one it is, and we've overpaid you by X amount of dollars. And they're like, well, this is what the living situation was this entire time. Can we not just have this agreement go back in time? You can't do that. You have to start it the same month that it's signed, or a future month if you're doing all of this in sort of advanced planning. In Missouri, I mentioned a minute ago, it has to be at least the same as that PMV number each year, right? Which right now is $300. In Missouri, they actually do require it to be fair market value. So there are some states where you could just charge $300 a month and that would be fine. And Social Security would recognize that as being a fair price to pay for your room and board. Missouri, unfortunately, has not that tacked on to that case law that established that. And so instead, they've said that it has to be fair market value. But fair market value is very subjective, right? I mean, fair market value depends on where you are, the neighborhood you're in, the type of place you're living in. So many factors that go into that. So I usually recommend that we do some number between like $400 and $600 for room and board, but then that's going to cover every food and shelter expense that person could need without having any detrimental effect to their monthly benefit. So they get the difference between that number and that $841 or whatever it will be in the future to use for other personal expenses that they might have. And of course, this is assuming, by the way, that there is no other reason for a monthly deduction, right? Because don't forget, we can still have a deduction for earned income and unearned income, even if you have these rental or room and board agreements in place. These are really put in place to prevent that ISM reduction. So the contract or the agreement also has to have, what is that monthly amount going to be? What is included in that amount? So for example, if it were just a rental contract and you were paying rent, but your rent includes some of your utilities, that needs to be spelled out in the document. The other thing is that if you are doing room and board, it's a shared space, you want to say that you are including food, that you will have your own bedroom, but you do have use of common spaces. So those types of things we want to put in there. Again, does not have to be super fancy or worded any particular way. We just want to be really clear in the document what it is exactly this person is paying for every month. And then again, if it does not include something, we need to say that. If you have a rental contract and it does not cover your gas bill, for example, and you're going to pay for that separately, we want to say that in the document so that everybody kind of is on the same page about what that number is including and why it might be lower in some cases because you are paying these other expenses separately. And then lastly, any dates or events that might change the terms of the contract. So in the template that you'll get, it will say on there, this number may change on January 1st of every year. And the reason is because January 1st of every year is when the monthly benefit amount changes generally. And so that therefore the VTR and those PMB numbers also go up accordingly. So we want to always be tracking those increases so that the monthly room and board amount or rental amount can be in line with those things. So you'll see that on there, but it is one thing you want to make sure. The other thing is if, for example, if someone is 18 and just getting on SSI, still at home with mom and dad, still attending school, right? They're going to stay with SSD until 21. You could say that at age 21 or at which time he or she may move into like an ISL setting or a residential setting or something, that would terminate the contract. You can kind of put those things in there. You don't have to be that specific though either. You could just simply terminate the contract whenever they're no longer living with you for whatever reason. I do want to mention, Alicia mentioned the ABLE accounts earlier. And again, that's, could be and has been a presentation all on its own. ABLE accounts are a fantastic thing and a fantastic resource to have available to the disability community. And for no discernible reason that anybody I know has been able to figure out, when the ABLE account statutes were being created, there was no part of that attributed any in-kind support and maintenance to payments made for things that would otherwise be in-kind support and maintenance if you made that payment from your personal checking account, for example, right? So you, mom and dad, can't pay for the electric bill and the rent from your own account. But if you have an ABLE account and you pay those exact same things from that account, there is no reduction in benefits. And it doesn't matter who funded the ABLE account. The money in there could have come from anybody. You could have had money in there from the last 16, well, not 16, it's not been in effect for that long, but birthday and Christmas and stuff, various people sending money to fund the ABLE account, and it wouldn't matter. You would have no reduction. And so that's something to keep in mind, because in those situations where we can't feasibly not pay something extra for somebody, right? Whether it's in a room and board agreement or a rental contract, let's say we have those things in place and there are still expenses that need to be paid for that would result in a reduction of the benefit. If we can somehow manage to do that from an ABLE account, that can also prevent it. The only thing about the ABLE account is it is still subject to those annual contribution limits, which right now, as of 2022, is $16,000 per year. And that's total. So that's not per contributor, that is total contributions to that account per year. So that's just a interesting little quirk of that particular law that thankfully actually is in place because it can be very helpful. We want to talk a little bit about some best practice tips and tricks. And really the overarching theme here is it's important to know exactly what the expenses are so that you can put them in the proper category and then make a plan for how that's going to get paid without reducing the benefit, right? So we want to know what the bills are, write every one of them down. And then let me go back to that screen. If it's shelter, right? Is it one of these 10 things or 9 things rather? Are we going to have to regularly pay for one of these things that is considered shelter under Social Security's definitions and could potentially be in-kind support and maintenance? Write them all down and decide what category they fall into. And then once you've got everything written down, determine who's going to provide the payment for that. And again, where we can, have the SSI recipient pay for food and shelter categories themselves. Food stamps, remember, they don't count. So that helps you put some extra money toward that food category. Maybe that frees up a little bit more of the actual 841 from SSI for the shelter expenses. But where you can, have that coming from SSI money, whether that's that flat rate through a room and board agreement or a rental contract, or depending on how independently functioning the SSI recipient is, let them go ahead and pay their bills every month if they can make that work in their budget just directly from a checking account, the same way you or I would. And then if you have expenses that are beyond that, beyond the 841, which is very likely, and they're not in the food or shelter category, and someone else is willing to pay for them, that's totally fine. No reduction, no issues, let somebody else pay for it. In whatever way makes the most sense to pay that particular expense, it's not going to be an issue. If there's another person who wants to cover something or is willing to, and it is a food or shelter expense, then that's where we start looking at how do we do that in a way that doesn't reduce the benefit. Do we ask them to put money into an ABLE account every month and then we pay from the ABLE account? We're not going to talk too much about them in this particular presentation, but does it make sense to put stuff into a special needs trust, right? And there's like a whole set of rules that kind of go along with that. It does not have that same exclusion the ABLE account would as far as the ISM goes, but there are sometimes some ways we can make that work. Make sure that where you do have to put one of those rental agreements or room and board agreements in place, that you provide Social Security with a copy of that. Every 2 years, they are supposed to do sort of a reevaluation of whether you are eligible for SSI or not, or remain eligible. They don't always stick to that exact schedule, but they are allowed to do it at least that much. And so if you just provide them with this information in the interim, then they've got it in their system when they schedule that appointment with you to go over what all that's going to look like. And that way, when they ask you the question, who lives in your household and how much are you paying for things, you can just point them in the direction of that agreement. And if it's older, remember, we've made it flexible so that it automatically says, automatically, this will go up every January, so that it's never below what that P&B number is for the year. So you don't even have to worry about redoing it every year. You've already put language in there that just makes that happen automatically. And again, that's in the template that we've provided in the materials that you're going to get. Okay, so let's dive into some scenarios. And this is where I miss being able to do stuff in person, because then we could kind of get, some interaction with the audience. But I'm just going to keep yapping at you for this one. So scenario number 1, Mr. Jack. So Jack is 23 and he lives in a house that his grandparents bought for him. So very nice grandparents, really doing Jack a solid. The house is titled in a special needs trust that his grandparents also created for him at the same time they bought the house, right? So that is different than what we've talked about before, but I'll talk about that one in a second. Jack buys his own food, but his grandparents pay for taxes, insurance, and utilities on the house, right? So that should be, sending up some red flags based on what we've talked about so far, that those things were listed in that list of what is a shelter expense, right? But in addition to paying for his own food, Jack also pays for his own cable bill, phone bill, and the quarterly homeowners association fee. And he does not pay rent to anyone. So after he pays for food and those few bills that he has, the rest of his money is his to spend as he pleases, no rent. So in this scenario, given what we've discussed before this, will Jack have a reduction in his monthly benefit? And the answer is yes, he will. He will have a reduction because he has no rental liability, right? He does not pay rent or room and board to any person, and an outside person, i.e. his grandparents, are paying for household expenses or shelter expenses. And I just want to make a special note here, and I want to talk for a few minutes about the way that a special needs trust plays into this scenario. Because for ISM purposes, for a reduction of those benefits, it does not matter whether the special needs trust is owned by his grandparents in their own personal name or by the special needs trust. The special needs trust is its own separate entity. It's a third person kind of hanging out there in the background, but it's still somebody who Jack would need to have rental liability to, right? In order to prevent any reduction at all from his benefits. There are some regions of Social Security, I believe, and again, it's kind of the same as why Missouri makes it be fair market value or not. Some people will say that you kind of have an equitable interest in the house because you're a beneficiary of the trust, and that because of that, you don't really need to pay anything. I've had this case actually came from, or this example rather, came from a real life case of mine, where this exact same thing happened, and the SSI beneficiary had both a reduction in his monthly benefit and an overpayment notice because he had been receiving the full benefit for a little over 2 years by the time they actually changed the monthly benefit. So, and grandparents were obviously doing a very nice thing and thought that they had covered all their bases because it was in a special needs trust, right? And Social Security said, no, you still have in-kind support and maintenance because the trust is paying for these things that are shelter expenses. So we had to put a room and board agreement in place. Again, we couldn't backdate it. So there really wasn't anything we could do about that intervening 2 years or so where he was overpaid. We had to put a room and board agreement in place going forward so that there would be no further reduction in his benefit. And another thing I'll point out is, even though in the POMS, which we showed you at the very beginning, the POMS pretty clearly says, if you have a rental liability, you do not have ISM. There is no ISM as long as your rental liability meets the standard rules. In this case, we actually had to appeal it because the caseworker at the local office said, it doesn't matter if you have a room and board agreement in place because the trust pays the taxes for the house, which is kind of a silly argument, right? Because so does every other landlord who owns any property that that one might rent. If you have an apartment, the person who owns that building is paying real estate taxes on that building, and they're not going around saying, well, every person who rents an apartment has to have a reduction in their benefit because their landlord is paying real estate taxes. But it's kind of an example of how infrequently these local offices see special needs trusts and are dealing with these issues and have a really solid understanding of how all of the things interact with each other. So we did have to appeal that. And once we got in front of the administrative law judge, she very quickly understood where the caseworker had made a mistake, but it required that extra step, that extra time As some of you may know, these Social Security doesn't necessarily move quickly. So in that, while you're waiting for all of that to take place, you're losing money every month. They are not paying you your full amount, even if you're going to get it kind of back to you after you win your appeal. That takes a while to happen. So having this stuff in place on the front end prevents a lot of complication down the line. So here's a little extra credit. Off topic, sorry, I'm going to tangent a little bit, but my sister-in-law is a sixth grade teacher, and she's posted this thing where she said she kind of left a blank page at the end of a test that she gave her kids, and it just said, what else do you know about this topic that I didn't ask you on the test? And it was a way for them to get some extra credit, because sometimes they studied this one section, it just happened not to have any questions on the test, and she wanted to know that they knew some stuff. They just didn't know what she asked them. Maybe they did. So anyways, here's some extra credit. So maybe you'll get some extra stuff to put down. Does it matter that Jack pays the HOA fees? So the answer to that is no. Generally, homeowners association or condominium fees are not considered household expenses. I won't scroll all the way back to it, but remember that list that had those 9 things, those are shelter expenses according to Social Security, and HOA fees and COA fees are not listed on that list of things. But sometimes those fees, and I think this is especially true in condominium fees, maybe more so than homeowners associations, but part of the fee that you pay for the condo fee every month is used to pay something that is a shelter expense, right? So sometimes those fees are for your sewer bill or cover part of your water. So the caseworkers are allowed to ask you for documentation that shows what those condo fees actually pay for. And if part of that fee goes toward things that would otherwise be ISM, they can apply a partial reduction for that amount. So in my experience, I haven't seen them dig down to that level on things, but the regulations do allow them to do that. So again, something to be aware of. So next, what if Jack's grandparents paid the real estate taxes and the insurance on the house in one lump sum during the same month? Because remember, we said in-kind support and maintenance is a monthly evaluation. They are looking at each month, did somebody else pay for something that was for food or shelter so that we can reduce your monthly benefit? And in my real life case, that is what happened, that they paid the taxes in December, as most of us do, and then paid the insurance payment in one payment, and it was at the same time. So does that matter to Social Security? The answer is no. So if you are paying taxes and insurance and you pay it all at once, there's a regulation that allows or instructs really Social Security to divide that one lump sum payment by 12 and then make the appropriate deduction per month. So if you paid $2,400 a year for your real estate taxes, they're going to divide that up accordingly and make the deduction per month. And depending on where that's coming from, inside or outside the house, right, determines which rule we're applying here and how much is going to be reduced. In this particular case, speaking of the rules, are we using the VTR rule, that 1/3 reduction, that's like an all or nothing, or the P&B rule? And this one, in this case, we're using VTR because the ISM is paid by somebody outside the household, it's paid by grandma and grandpa. And so that monthly reduction of $280 is assessed. $280 is the 2022 number. And it doesn't matter if the actual amount or actual monthly deduction would be less than that. Let's say the taxes and insurance were the only extra things that got paid for, and that is actually less than $280, that wouldn't matter. Remember, VTR is all or nothing. Somebody else paid it. $280 is getting deducted from your monthly payment. So let's turn to our next example. Diane just turned 18, still living at home with her parents. She was recently approved for SSI benefits, and but she's still at home. She's still in high school attending special education classes, and will be in high school until she's 21 and ages out, right? And because she is 18 and still living at home, and nothing really is different from when she was 17, right? She does not pay for any of her household or food expenses. Her parents have always paid that for her, so they just continue paying that for her while she lives in their home. She uses her SSI money to pay for her entertainment and other miscellaneous things. She goes out, she has fun with her friends, and then she puts a portion of that into her ABLE account each month, right? So no portion of her $841 per month is going to household or food expenses. This, I think, is the more common scenario in my experience. And also, I don't know if anybody was on here, maybe this was before we started the webinar. I was putting this presentation together, and my kids walked in the room and they saw the title of it, and they're like, I can't believe you're going to charge kids rent. That's so mean. And that's like what parents think about, right? If you've got a kid who's still in school, living at home, maybe they have younger siblings or whatever, you're not going to all of a sudden change up the way you've been doing it something for this entire time because they start getting this monthly payment, right? And it feels mean sometimes to some people to do that, but it's important to understand the consequences of not doing that, right? Because getting SSI provides this extra sum of money. We want to be able to make the best use of it. So is it going to reduce Diane's benefits? And that obviously the answer is yes. She paid none of her own expenses. She's 18 now. She's living with other people in the household. Even though it's mom and dad and siblings, they're no longer legally required to provide those things for her as far as Social Security is concerned. And again, why? Because she has no rental liability. She doesn't pay for any of her food and shelter. She doesn't have a rental contract or a room and board agreement with her parents. So she is getting a reduction, even if she has nothing else, no income, no earned income, no unearned income, she's still going to get a reduction because of this. So does it matter that Diane is still in high school? It doesn't. Right, she's over 18. Her school status or her student status doesn't really make a difference. The only thing I'll say here, and I put a little note, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but there are some special rules related to income. So not to the in-kind support and maintenance. It doesn't really impact that at all. But if you do have a college student and they receive some forms of assistance, sometimes that income is excluded under those separate rules. So just something to keep in mind, because I said student status does not matter. Most of the time that is true, but there are some very specific instances where you may be able to exclude some of the funds that they receive. Does it help that Diane puts some portion of her money into her ABLE account every month? So for purposes of ISM and whether or not she's going to have that monthly reduction of her benefits, it doesn't matter. However, let's say they realize the error of their ways, right? They put a room and board agreement in place, and mom and dad just take that money and put it into her ABLE account every month. And then if at some point she moves out of mom and dad's home into a more independent living environment, and she does have food or shelter expenses that are not covered by that $840 or whatever happens to be by the time she moves out, the ABLE account can pay for those things without a reduction. So, you know, for our purposes, for what we're talking about, as far as that monthly reduction, makes no difference that she's putting money in her ABLE account, but it is an option on the table for her to keep doing it, or for mom and dad to take the rent money and put it into that account for her benefit. Again, we're subject to that $16,000 per year limit. If the only thing you have is SSI and that's the only thing that's going to fund the ABLE account, you're not going to worry about hitting that. It's not going to be an issue, but it is still something you can do. So mom and dad could not put all that rent money into the ABLE account and then add another, you know, 10,000 of their own money in 1 year, because that would put them over the 16. And then, okay, so in this particular case, is it the VTR rule or the PMV rule? In this case, it's the PMV rule. because it's people she lives with inside the household that are paying for these food and shelter expenses. And because of that, we've got that $300.33 reduction instead of the $280. And again, the monthly amount is not a huge difference. I think the bigger benefit to having the PMB rule apply is that it's rebuttable. We can show that the value of these things is less than $300 and try to get it to go down. We cannot do that for BTR. I think you'd have a hard time saying that the value of what mom and dad are providing is less than $300 a month, realistically speaking. But it's at least possible, depending on the situation. If you guys wanted to bring on the questions, Alicia and I will start answering some of those.
Great. So we do have some questions. I'll start with the first one is, why does Missouri have specific rules for SSI? Is this not a national program?
So SSI is a national program. It's a federal program run by Social Security Administration, which is obviously a federal agency. But the Social Security Administration is divided into regional centers, and there have been cases that have come up through the ranks in those regions that end up at civil courts that are specific to the region. So in Missouri, right, we have, if we're looking on a federal level, we're in the 8th Circuit. These cases that have come up outside of that are in the 2nd and the 7th Circuit. So they're not, because it's not a law, it's from a case, it doesn't apply universally. You can use it, we could use it, we could go into a court and say, hey, well, here's what the 7th Circuit said, but they're not required to follow it. So sorry, that was like a little mini law school course on who has control over things.
So if my adult child's SSI is already reduced by 1/3 for the ISM, but I want to create a room and board agreement going forward, how do I initiate that change with Social Security?
Yeah, so you would need to provide them a copy of the document once you've completed it. And I usually like to include a letter that just says, we've had a reduction for this, but this is how we're fixing it now. So we would like you to enter this agreement into their record with Social Security and then increase it moving forward. And that usually should take place the first of the month following the month they get notification. So if you executed a document in April and sent it to Social Security in May, the benefit should go back up to the full amount. Not always. So sometimes you have to stick on, stay with them a little bit to get them to actually make the change. And again, not every caseworker at the local office, which is where you're sending this and who's going to process it, will understand how that impacts it. So sometimes you just have to call them and walk them through a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nikki, I don't know as far as what you think now, which most effective is sending in that information, but it sounds like it's right now, most of it, everything has to be sent in by mail. And, if there's a local caseworker that you have a contact with, but I know it's very daunting to figure out where to send something and have it fall into the right hands.
That's been a problem all through COVID. It was especially an issue when the Social Security people were working remotely because they weren't really getting anything. And for anybody who's ever interacted with them, that they're not exactly like clamoring to give out their contact information. So if you mail it to your local office, you're probably okay. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take somebody to process that at this point. I think most local offices, even if they aren't accepting walk-in people yet, do have a drop box at the location. So you could technically drive it over there and put it in the drop box.
The other thing I've done is use certified mail.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that it was delivered and somebody
right.
signed for it.
Yeah. So you at least, they can't say they didn't get it if you do it that way. Right? Doesn't necessarily mean they process it any faster, but at least you can say, but hey, you had it. So you have to use that date as the date that you should have had it in your system.
The next question is, does money placed in an ABLE account by parents affect monthly SSI check as a gift? And does it need to be reported to SSI?
Nope, does not affect, it's not a gift for SSI purposes. And in fact, the ABLE account rule is under IRS regulations. And there isn't anywhere in that rule that gives Social Security the ability to request like a full accounting of that account. So to ask for statements and things like that. From that perspective, Social Security needs to know that you have one, and they're allowed to know what the balance is, but they are not the ones who have the authority to do anything further than that necessarily with the account.
How does charging rent affect the parents' taxes? If our household costs go up or down in the future, how does that affect rent?
We'll preface that with like the traditional lawyer thing, which is we are not accountants. So you always want to double check this with whoever does your taxes, but.
Right, for sure. But I think it seems to me that if you're not in the business of, you're not trying to make money and your rent is, below what fair market value rent. And I know we talked about, you need to be close to what fair value rent is in Missouri. But I think you're still entitled to not count that as income, and then to still use your same household expenses as you would, I guess, if you're figuring out your itemized deductions on your real estate tax and those types of things. Those are still, still able to use those as deductions on your tax return.
The only thing I'm thinking is if the second part of the question about what happens if your household expenses go up, you're always able to increase the rent amount, but you don't have to. So, for people who want to kind of set that fixed amount and really leave it alone for the most part, you're not required to monitor your own household expenses every month. And for example, right now, groceries and gas are so much more expensive, right? You don't have to say, I paid 30% more in groceries this month, therefore I have to raise the rent amount 30% more. That's not necessary. You just still collect that flat amount that is part of the agreement, and you're fine. When we say fair market value, again, remember it's a flexible concept. So we don't really have to get into the weeds so much, and make sure it's like a percentage of the actual expenses or anything like that.
Can a disabled adult child pay rent and still be a dependent on parents' taxes?
So the general rule to claim somebody as a dependent is you provide, correct me if I'm wrong, Alicia, 50%, right, of their needs. And so if you couldn't show that you were still providing 50% of their needs after you subtract what you're getting in rent, then I don't know that you could have it both ways.
Right.
When I begin to draw Social Security benefits, my son will go from SSI to SSDI. Half of my monthly Social Security income will be about $11.70 a month, which my son will be able to claim. Will that income automatically disqualify my son from receiving Medicaid? And if yes, is there a way to have him receive less than 50% of my Social Security monthly income?
Okay, so I'll tackle the last piece of that. The answer to the last part about can he receive less than 50% is no. That program is called Childhood Disability Benefits, or CDB, and that's a fixed formula. It's not something that Social Security will change.
And
The
it
other
will
part is
not
Medicaid
automatically affect Medicaid benefits, other than they may have to start paying a monthly spend down amount or stipend.
Right. It's going to depend on what the income limit is in the year that the change actually goes into effect. Right now, that would be above what a single person can have to not have a spend down, but not by a ton.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on how far in the future this is, that limit may have gone up beyond that number.
This question asks, are there things that SSI money cannot be used for?
I mean, no, the only thing you're concerned about is whether spending it on any particular thing will reduce your monthly benefit. But short of that, there's no restriction on it. No.
Can you still claim a person as a dependent on your taxes, or will it affect their SSI payment?
That we fit the rules for a dependent, then you can claim them as a dependent. It depends on the support rules and how much you're providing. But that shouldn't affect their benefit.
Right. That's more about, are you in compliance with IRS rules?
Right.
SSI doesn't care about that.
Building on the question about rent and taxes, and there's two questions that are the same. If they no longer have a mortgage or rent payment as a parent or a family, can they still charge rent, and what impact does that have?
Yes, because there's still expenses, there's still real estate tax, there's still homeowners insurance, those things can still count as household expenses that rent could be applied to.
Right. And remember, we're always thinking about what if they weren't living with mom and dad and had to go rent something out on the market, what would that cost them? So it's not tied necessarily to what mom and dad's actual expenses are. It's more about what the fair market says it would cost them to rent a room in a house, for example, something like that. What, an apples to apples comparison on the open market.
And then this is our last question right now. We applied for SSI last May of 2021. If we get SSI, for instance, we get it in May of 2022, and get that approval, will it be backdated? And if so, should we begin charging rent before the approval?
Yes, it will be backdated to the first of the month following the month of your application. So if you applied in May, I think you said May, right? Then it would be starting June 1st. And the template that you'll get in the materials has something in there that says, if they can't pay it right now because they aren't receiving their SSI benefit, then they have to pay us when they receive that lump sum. So you could go ahead and put the agreement in place so that there's a way to use up some of that back pay when you do finally get it. And it's already in place for those months going forward when the SSI actually starts coming every month. Thank you. Thank you for watching. And we have on here our website. There's some resources on there that you can turn to. We do blog posts and some other stuff. We try to keep as much on there as possible to keep people updated. So feel free to look at that. The other thing, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to us, because I know it's we try to pare it down as much as we can, but it is a complicated area that has all sorts of weird rules. And like Alicia mentioned at the beginning, caseworkers are looking at those POMs, and those POMs can change, at any time at a whim. They're not subject to the same rules. It's not like changing a law. Sometimes you think you're doing things right, and then the POMs change without you knowing it, and all of a sudden it blows up, and you've got to come in and fix something.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing some of you again. I'd like to thank Nikki and Alicia for their back work and their front work. Thank you all so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you all in the future.